Yes. Yeah.
Done.
Great. All right. Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is a Mediate.com course entitled The Path to Excellence, Reflective Practice and Mindfulness. We're fortunate today to have Michael Lang joining us. Michael Lang has over 30 years experience in family, organizational, congregational, public policy, and international disputes. He is a renowned leader in the field, a trainer, a practitioner, an author, a teacher, and sorry, can we stop and start over?
And by the way, no international.
Okay.
It's for sure.
Good.
Yeah, but that would be fine.
They kicked a rock. The pavers kicked a rock at the side of my house, and it startled me. And I was really trying to cover, but I couldn't quite do it. All right, I'm good now. I'm focused. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for a Mediate.com course entitled The Path to Excellence, Reflective Practice and Mindfulness. We are so fortunate today to have Michael Lang with us. He is a renowned practitioner with over 30 years of experience in the dispute resolution field. He has worked in the family, organizational, congregational, and public policy arenas, and as well as being a leader in the field, he is a well-known teacher, author, practitioner, and trainer. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael, and I look forward to your course.
Thanks very much, Claire. Let me begin with a brief introduction, and then we're going to focus on the content of this webinar, this course. So first of all, why the name? What's the point of this presentation? And what I want to say is that I chose the path to excellence because I see that what we are, and I've had this image for a very, very long time, that we're on a journey of constant learning, of becoming more efficient, proficient, resourceful, and adept at what we do. And I don't see that that there is a specific destination, that there's a point at which we say to ourselves, oh, that's it, I've achieved excellence. As one person said, a very smart person said, think about it in terms of fruit. What happens after a fruit ripens? And that is that it rots. So we never want to get to that place that we are just complacent and think that we have all the knowledge and all the skills and all the abilities, all the wisdom that we could possibly need. So that's why I have chosen the metaphor of the path. All right, we're going to look at the slides that I have developed, and I'm going to be talking our way through them. The first three are different images of pathways, and I've chosen to use images of pathways to continue the metaphor. And I've chosen three very different ones, as you will see, because there is no one single path that makes sense to any of us. That the journey that we take as practitioners is absolutely unique to each of us. We share common experiences, we share sets of values, principles, ethical standards, techniques that we use, but we use all of that in a way that's utterly unique to each of us. So, for example, here is an old village with cobblestone streets, a beautiful old place. For some of us, this is enchanting, it's lovely, we like the age of it, we like the sense that it has history, and others would look at this path and say, It's just simply not for me. Those cobblestones are too rough. The buildings are too old. So the next path is one that goes through a hilly area. And you see the stone path, the fog. Again, this is to represent those people who would find being in a more natural surrounding a metaphor for how they see their own journey as practitioners. And the third example is a walkway in a city along the water. And again, just a completely different idea for how we see our journey. And lastly, a city street, busy, active, probably more vehicular than pedestrian traffic. I'm not going to go beyond that in terms of this metaphor of the pathway. Believe me, I've done enough, I hope, to shape the sense of what I see as as we move forward. So in thinking about how we become excellent at our practice, it occurs to me that it's really important to identify certain kinds of practices that are generic. That is, that no matter how you implement them, these ideas, I call them elements. In my book, The Making of a Mediator, my co-author Allison Taylor and I referred to them as hallmarks. But the idea is that these are ways in which we actually implement and are reflective of excellence in our work. There are 9 of them here. I'm sure that those of you who are watching and listening to this could come up with a few more. There's some here that you will find your favorites, some that you find less valuable to you. That's as it should be. The idea is to take these ideas that are mine, that are based on my readings, my study, my writing, and most importantly, my experience, and say, here are some common practical approaches that lead to really effective and competent practice. And we're going to go through each of them, and I'm going to provide you with brief examples for each as well. So the first is open to new perspectives. And with each of these, I'm going to provide you with several quotes, then an image, and then I'm going to talk to you about an example out of my experience or out of experience of colleagues that I know about that reflects this idea. So the important thing about being open to new perspectives is to, and you're going to see this and hear this as a thread throughout, that one of the characteristics of superb practitioners is their willingness to be humble, their willingness to recognize that they don't know everything, that there's always something new to learn, and that doubt, as Voltaire says, it may not be a pleasant position, but certainty is an absurd one. And I take that to mean that it is a challenge for us. We do struggle when we doubt something, but in that struggle, in that thinking about something, trying to make sense of it, is where our learning growth can occur. The other 2 quotes I think are really wonderful. I'm particularly drawn to the Stephen Hawking quote, and hope that as you're listening to me and looking at these slides, you also find these particularly helpful. So this is an image that you'll see for each of the elements that I've drawn on. So I want to tell you briefly a story that reflects the idea of open to new perspectives. And that is that a colleague and I were asked to intervene in a workplace dispute, a problem that had occurred in the workplace involving sexual harassment of an employee. And the goal we were given by the people who, the CEO who hired us, was to return the female employee to the workplace safely. So our original objective was to focus on what had occurred and to consider the possibility that a mediation involving the woman who had experienced harassment and the 3 people who were principally involved in, allegedly, in doing the harassment. But this was a workplace of about 40 people altogether. They worked quite closely with one another. They all knew each other. And we began to shift our perspective as we gathered more and more information. And we began to see this not as a single incident or a couple of incidents that involved a few of the employees, in particular, the woman who was sexually harassed, but rather that there was a culture within this group that enabled and supported this kind of behavior. And so we shifted our focus then to the entire group. And as we did that, one of the things that we realized is that, no, it wasn't just that the group culture created an environment in which the harassment was condoned, if not encouraged, but rather it was also a failure of leadership. Because as it turned out, the leader, the person principally responsible for these 40 people, was effectively an absent manager, disconnected, and so our work began to shift, first from the idea of doing a dyadic or small group mediation to doing a group intervention to then doing an intervention with the manager. And it turned out that all 3 of those became part of the work that we did in this particular workplace. So we had to be open at all times. We had to resist the idea that, aha, we've really got it. We've really figured this out, because at every step of the way, we realized that we had only figured out a small piece of this larger puzzle. All right. So ambiguity is another very curious element. Freud, I think, has it. Neurosis is the inability to tolerate ambiguity. That one of the gifts mediators have is the ability to be in the presence of ambiguity and not feel the necessity for squashing it, for clarifying it necessarily, for forcing some kind of certainty on a situation that is, in fact, ambiguous. And it means that well, let me give you an example. In a divorce mediation, the parties who had substantial assets, no children at this age, at their age, that were of any concern to them as far as the mediation was concerned. It was purely about financial matters. And they had resolved hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of assets and liabilities and income and expenses and so on. And we were at the stage where I was recapping their agreement prior to writing up a memorandum of understanding for them. And it happened that in this particular arrangement, the wife was retaining the family home and keeping most of the furnishings, the furniture, things like that. And it was very agreeable. And there was no dispute really from the husband about that. And it came down to a point at which the husband said, I have one more thing that I need before I can sign off on this deal. He said, I want you to buy me a washer dryer. And it came completely out of the blue. I had no idea what to do in that moment. It seemed as though that perhaps $1,000 worth of appliances was going to had the potential to undo hundreds of thousands of dollars of very carefully structured, carefully thought through arrangements that they had made. And my initial instinct was to want to put a damper on that, to say, no, that's not that big a deal. And, and I withheld that. I had, however, it came to me, the presence of mind to just let that uncertainty, that ambiguity sit. And as it unfolded, the wife was incredulous as well, and initially quite angry. And then she asked him why he wanted that. And his point to her was, you got everything in the house. I have to start completely over. And she said, but you have all the money to be able to do that. He said, it doesn't matter. I'm the one who still has to go out to the furniture store and buy furniture. I'm the one who has to go to the appliance store to buy the appliances. I want you to do something for me. I want you to, and they had a really thoughtful and caring conversation, in the result of which was that they went shopping together and she paid for a washer and dryer for him. So it is important. Claire, I see you've got a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, a lot of the time when I'm working with people, they fear ambiguity. We all do. And so they see part of my role there is to help to find things and clarify things for them. And so I understand what you're saying, that ambiguity can be a difficult experience to go through, but that it can have a lot of value. And so I'm wondering, how can you communicate that to people that you're working with, or how can you normalize that feeling and help them to be comfortable with that, with those moments of ambiguity?
It's a great question. Thank you. And here is what I have learned and what I think is helpful. First of all, your behavior throughout the mediation needs to send out this particular signal. You need to be able, when parties are confused and they're struggling to find clarity and certainty, and it just won't come to them, that you need to have the patience to be able to sit with them and acknowledge the ambiguity in that moment, and to say that of course it's difficult, of course it's frustrating, of course it's confusing, it's unsettling. And you validate, you don't validate because it's their experience, you honor their experience. So that's one of the things you can do that's verbal. Mm-hmm. And another thing you can do is just simply not jump in. We have the tendency, we become mediators because we want to be helpful. We believe that through our efforts, we can help people move through a conflict situation that's really troubling to them. And so we want to be helpful. And in that moment, when there is such a struggle to overcome the uncertainty of a particular situation or a moment, one of the things that is a hallmark of our capacity to be really effective is not doing anything. By that, I don't mean that we are just ignoring what's taking place. We're very conscious of what's happening, but we're making a specific choice not to say anything. We, by our silence, we help create the space in which, the conversational space in which they can try to work some of this through. And only when they get to a place where they're ready to talk about solutions can we assist them in coming up with a variety of ideas and them brainstorming and then making some choices for themselves. But that's what it requires: patience, it requires deliberation, and it requires behavior that signals to the parties, you're okay. The situation right now isn't, but you are, and this is going to be all right in the end.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You know, it isn't a prediction. Let me just say this as well, Claire. It's not a prediction that everything is going to be perfect. You're not telling them that you know what the answer is, because that would be disingenuous and disrespectful. What you're saying is that you trust that they have the ability, together with your support and assistance, to settle the matter themselves, to work through the place of uncertainty and resolve their confusion and the ambiguity in whatever way makes good sense to them.
Mm-hmm. Right, thanks.
Sure. So I love this photo of the grass growing out in the most unpredictable place possible in this metal pipe. Okay, moving on to the next. Resilience, be resilient. I love the first quote: behave like a duck, keep calm on the surface, but paddle like hell underwater. And that's what it feels like often when we are resilient, that we are, we feel, and you know, in one of the very first divorce mediations I did nearly 35 years or more ago, the first few mediations, people had been very congenial, actually, and easily worked out their difficulties. And now I was dealing with the first time with a couple who were shouting at each other in a constructive way, as I really understood it. But I was terrified about what I was supposed to do. And that was it. I was paddling like hell underwater, but having to maintain a calm surface in order to be effective and useful. And let me give you an example that's both humorous and infuriating. I was conducting a post-divorce mediation. And the mediation was taking place in the office of one of the attorneys who was representing the husband. And the wife was also represented. And we had been meeting this dispute among between because it was about parenting matters, had gone on for 12 years. They had been in and out of court at least once a year, sometimes 2 and 3 times a year in the 12 years since they'd been divorced. And I was asked by a judge to take this mediation. And we were making tremendous progress over the period of the day. We started at 10 in the morning, and we were working quite well, and it was around 4:30 in the afternoon. And we were within a hair's breadth of coming to an agreement. The wife was a very careful person. She liked to deliberate. She liked to think about things. She liked to look at the words. She was, in some ways, a bit hesitant, not about the ultimate objective, but how to make sure we get there. She was cautious. And whereas the husband, although he was extremely thoughtful and responsive, he was more facile and quick at being able to make decisions. And his attorney mirrored that, whereas her attorney mirrored her behavior, careful, thoughtful. And at 4:30, the husband's attorney came into the room and said, "We're closing the office at 5 o'clock. That's it. Either do it or don't do it, but I'm out of here at 5 o'clock." And I was in caucus with the wife and her lawyer, and all three of us looked at him incredulously, knowing how much had been accomplished and how long it had been from the time of their divorce to this day, when a reasoned and effective agreement could resolve long time disputes. And I went out into the corridor and spoke with him, and I said, "That's not, we're making good progress, and we're doing all right, and I'm going to go back in." He said, "Well, you got a half an hour." So at 25 minutes passed, and he came in, and again, without knocking, just simply poked his head in and said, "You got 5 minutes." And I went out and again said to him, "We need probably 30 minutes to do this." And he said, "Well, no, you got 5 minutes. And by the way, I already sent my client home, so there's not going to be any agreement today." I was stunned that he would have such presumption to determine without consultation how the mediation was going to go. And I followed him, talking with him, trying to reason with him, and he quite literally had a large black plastic bag into which he was emptying all of the waste baskets in the office as we walked around. And finally, I just realized that I was going to get nowhere with him. And I walked back and spoke with the wife and former wife, I guess I should say, and her attorney, and said, "We're not going to reach an agreement today, but the mediation is going to continue. And it's going to continue via email. And we're not going to go through this again. We're not going to have another meeting like this. But I'm going to use the authority that the judge gave me to make that decision that the mediation is not over." And so they left, and I communicated that to the ex-husband's attorney, and we proceeded. But it took all of my rational self to realize the futility of arguing with the husband's attorney, and instead turn to problem solving to find an answer that ultimately, as it happened, resolved the dispute after 12 years of post-divorce wrangling. So, next. I just love this image of the open space, the stars, and the field. Okay. We need to be able to pay attention to detail. This is the next in our elements. What happens often among mediators after we've had a few years of experience and we've begun to see patterns of interaction, patterns of behavior, patterns in terms of the types of disputes that come to us, and a pattern in terms of how they are resolved, we can very easily become lulled into a kind of complacent competence. I call it, being in the rut, where you are you're moving along, you're doing decent work, you're being capable, but you don't have the passion, you don't have the energy, you don't have the enthusiasm and that you once had, because you've gotten pretty good at what you're doing, and it doesn't take the kind of effort that it did originally. And I think that one of the things that happens to us in that moment, in those moments, is that we fail to pay attention to important details. We overlook them because we have the larger picture, and we see how that larger picture is likely to develop and unfold. And that's what we end up focusing on. Instead, we need to pay as much attention to the detail as we do to the larger picture. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. One that happened to me. Earlier this year, I had cataract surgery. And in the course of the procedure, the pre-op, drops were put in my eyes. I met with the nurse anesthetist who told me what was going to happen. And then eventually I was taken into the into the operating theater for what was probably no more than 8 or 10 minutes of a procedure. Throughout, because I was not unconscious, I was alert and awake the entire time, I was aware that the nurse anesthetist held my hand the entire time. And the next morning, when I went for my follow-up visit with the physician, I asked her about this, and she said, "It's absolutely intentional." She said, "We do it purposefully because we want you to know that with all the machinery and the lights and the sounds and everything else that's going on there, there's a human being who's right next to you. And that we too are human beings. We are not just extensions of these machines." And I thought, wow, that's really, it was an extraordinary moment for me. I really appreciated it. And it reminded me of how important these little details are. I mean, with all of the exquisite, delicate work that the surgeon was doing and the machinery that has been developed that is so remarkable in what it can help the surgeons accomplish. What was prominent to me was something that would seemingly go unnoticed. But because it's so small, and in that gesture of handheld holding.
That's beautiful.
I'll tell you quickly, Claire, that as a follow-up, I had the second eye done about 10 days later. And because I had commented so warmly to the surgeon about this, not only did the nurse anesthetist hold my hand, she used her thumb to rub the back of it.
Oh,
It was,
that's great.
Yeah, I almost had a feeling that somewhere on my medical chart there was patient loves touch, do as much as often. But let's turn it back now to our work as mediators. And here's the situation. I was doing an introduction in divorce mediation before the parties were there on their own. Before they came, I had come to mediation. Had lengthy half-hour conversations with each of them. Not so much to hear their story, but to introduce myself and to make sure they understood what mediation was and to confirm that they really wanted to participate. And so I launched into my introduction, and I noticed that the husband was nodding occasionally, looking at me, and the entire time the wife sat arms across her chest, looking above my head at a spot on the wall, and her gaze never shifted. And so I stopped about halfway through. My introduction probably takes 10 minutes at the very, very most. But I stopped and I said, "I'm curious. I've noticed, I don't know you. Maybe this is just the way you pay attention." She said, "No." She said, "Of course I'm upset. How would you feel if 2 weeks ago you found out that your husband had been having an affair with your best friend for a year, and you're now to show up in mediation and resolve all of these different disputes? Oh. I took a deep breath. It was a moment.
Yeah.
It was, 30 years or 25 years later, I can still see this woman sitting in that chair and then crying as she expressed this. And as a result of having paid attention to that small detail, I then said, "What do you need?" And she said, "I just need to be sure that the bills are going to get paid, and then I need to get out of here, and I'll come back another time, but not soon." So we spent 15 minutes. She left assured that the finances were in order. We made a tentative booking for 8 weeks later. And sure enough, after 8 weeks, they came back and were able to, she was in a frame of mind where she could focus on what she needed, on the details and on the future, and was able to participate fully, whereas before she would have, she was zombie-like in how she was approaching it. Okay. I suppose in the best framing of this, no pun intended, is that they are reading up about this painting and or about the museum. However, my cynical side says they're just that each of them is actually texting somebody who's sitting right next to him or her. I mean, this is the absolute opposite of paying attention to detail. And I'm not going to go on anymore and become accused of being a Luddite, of being anti-technology, or being insensitive to teenagers' needs for screen time. So we're going to move on. Simplicity. You know, as adults, as competent, resourceful practitioners, we can tend to think of things in far too complex ways. Sometimes that is a gift, that we are able to manage the complexity and the multiplicity of issues and help our clients think through what to do. But we need to find a balance between that and the simplicity, the immediacy of what's taking place in the moment. And I'm going to tell you just something that I observed on an airplane flight recently, and I wrote a short article about this. In the seat back in this particular plane, there was a screen, and I was seated next to, I was on the aisle. Adjacent to me in the center was the father, was the father, and then at the window seat was his daughter. I gathered that from their interactions, not because I'd spoken with them. And I estimated her age to be maybe 9. And they were playing tic-tac-toe. And she played many games, but this happened to be one of them. And I looked up and I watched and I listened, because she said to her father, "That's it. I've lost 5 times. I'm done. It's over. This is a really stupid game." And the father said, "What are you doing that you think might be causing this problem? What's happening that's causing you to lose?" She said, "I don't know. I play the same way every time." He said, "If you were going to play it differently, what would you do?" And she said, "Well, I'd put the X here instead of there." And of course she did. And sure enough, she won.
Mm.
And then she did it again, and she won. And a third time, and she won. And then she lost, and she got frustrated. And then she turned to her father with a sweet grin and said, "I know, Dad, try a different way." That's exactly, it's in that simple little exchange. There was so much that happened. It would have been so easy for the father to say, well, you know, this is a kid, you know, and to describe everything about tic-tac-toe and how you lose and how you win and so on, and give her this whole educational piece. Instead, he stayed out of her learning and just helped her stay calm enough and that she could think for herself and learn something about the game. And to me, that's the kind of just simplicity that sometimes we can bring. And we can do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about curiosity as well, and this is really related because sometimes our questions, if we are genuinely curious, if we're not being voyeuristic, if we're not interrogating, sometimes it's these very simple questions that are essentially saying, I'm curious, how come you think that way? That can lead parties to be able to talk about what their motivations are or what is holding them back from agreeing to a particular arrangement. So, lovely image.
Mm-hmm.
Simple.
Yeah.
This expression, I've tried to find the origin of it. There's a pop song that uses this lyric, but that's not where I first heard it, I'm sure, because I heard it 25 or more years ago. And it has meant a great deal to me. Because the hold on tightly, for me, means that we have convictions. We have beliefs. We have ideas. We have competence and experience. And at the same time, we need to not hold on to that so tightly that it becomes a constraint, that in fact we cage ourselves with our convictions. And humility, as Ken Blanchard says, actually allows us to let go of the absolute certainty of our convictions and be open to the possibility, to new possibilities. And this is about wonder and mystery, as Anais Nin says. So when I think about hold on tightly, let go lightly, I'll give you another example. And I was contacted by a department manager who was concerned about two supervisors in his department who were intended to be working cooperatively together. And in fact, the department was built, structurally was built on that kind of an arrangement, and functionally worked much better when the two of them could collaborate, work together, cooperate, find ways to support and assist each other. And for some reason, the goodwill between these two supervisors had evaporated, and they were at odds with one another, and therefore they were less effective. And from the manager's point of view, the department was then less productive and efficient. So I arranged to conduct a mediation with the two of them, with the usual preliminaries of having conversations, planning things out. And we had set aside an entire day. And halfway through the morning, it became abundantly clear to me that this was that this problem involved everybody within the department, including the department head. And that working on resolving the dispute between the two supervisors would be helpful. There's no question about that. Ultimately, it wouldn't, there was a high likelihood that the problem they experienced would simply show up somewhere else. When I do my work, I often use a systems analysis, in which case I think about the entire group of people as the system, and I think about the conflict that's occurring between any two, three, four people as the symptom, as what helps identify that in fact there is a problem within the system itself. And so I began to ask a few questions of the two of them. And throughout the rest of the day, what we did, because I had a limited brief, my focus was, and my contract was to work with them, not only did they resolve their difference and figure out how they were going to work effectively, but they also began to identify the problems within the organization and what each of them and they together could do to address the larger problem. So had I just focused only on the one dispute between the two of them, we would have been finished in 2 to 3 hours. They would have happily gone their way. It would have been, by general measures, successful. But in fact, it would have been incomplete. And it was only by letting go of the initial assumption about the nature of the conflict that I could offer them some alternative ways of dealing with what's happening in their organization.
Thank you.
Yeah. Curiosity. This is at the heart, to me, of our work, and we need to manifest that curiosity, as a caution, with these two things in mind. Always protect and honor the dignity of the people. Just because they're in conflict doesn't make them any less, it doesn't make them into victims, doesn't make them into people who are less competent, less effective. So their dignity matters, and we need to treat them with respect, which has to do with the way in which we talk with them, the way in which we engage with them, the way in which we pay attention to the things that they say. And within that framework, it's really important to be curious, to have this sense of wonder. It is, to me, I think of this as being like the 3 or 4-year-old. And Claire, who's listening, has children, she'll be able, younger children, she'll relate to this, I'm sure. And I have grandchildren and my children when they were younger. This is such a universal thing that happens, that a child will come to you with a question that's important to the child, and you will give a thoughtful response. And the child will look at you and with a smile and say, why? And then you'll give a response to that. And the child will nod and say, why? And this could go on and on and on and on, because they are sponges. They are learning how to create a world for themselves and to learn about the world. And the way they have to do it, in addition to their own experience, is to ask us whom they trust, for information, for responses, for our take on certain situations. And I think if we can bring that sense of curiosity and wonder to our work, it's really, really important. We need to act sometimes like the 3 or 4-year-old and be unashamed and unembarrassed and unafraid to ask our clients why. Always with respect, but to ask them why. And to have a reason for our curiosity. It isn't just mindlessly asking a bunch of questions just to engage with them. This isn't just getting to know them for the sake of learning about their background. There needs to be a purpose, of course. And I had an extraordinary experience. I was asked by a friend to do some work in Canada where I had done a fair amount of work. And she sort of teased me into doing this. She said, "Would you like to work in Canada?" I said, "Sure, I'd love to." I'm thinking Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. My wife is Canadian, so that would make a difference as well. And I said, "Sure." She said, "Great. It's a workplace." She described the basic problem. I said, "Great, interesting." She next said, "So how's your health?" I said, "Well, Ruth, it's great. Thanks for asking. Why?" She said, "Well, because this place, there's no hospital, no physicians, a nurse practitioner, and if you fall ill, they have to medevac you, and that's dependent on the weather." I said, "Oh, where is this?" And it turned out that I was in the Canadian Arctic in a 1,400 person Inuit village. Coming from Florida, I'd lived in northern climates enough to know that it was going to be cold, but for 10 years before this, I'd lived in Florida and had to run around and ask friends to send me parkas and sweaters and things that I could wear. So I knew that that would be a tremendous change for me, a shift. I had some sense because I've worked in different cultures, not extensively, but enough to know that there would be something in the nature of the culture that was part of this dispute, and that I needed to have enough curiosity to be able to ask some questions so that I could understand enough to respectfully help in working out the dispute. And the people I was working with were generous in that regard. They had my resume, they knew all about me, they knew all about my years of experience and writings and this and that. And I acknowledged that to them and said, but in your culture, I'm a complete novice. And for me to help you, I might need to ask a lot of questions in order to understand what's going on. Is that okay? And they responded enthusiastically. They were excited to be able to share their culture with me, their experience with me, and to help me understand how their culture affected the conflict within this workplace. It was fascinating. But it was because I was willing to be humble and that my curiosity was tempered by humility and respect for them. Okay. Love this image of this kid. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Now, So learn ceaselessly. This may seem self-evident. The fact is that it isn't. We think about learning in the sense that we learn from the books we read, the seminars we attend, the conference workshops we participate in, the webinars that we watch and listen to. And all of that absolutely is an essential element of our essential elements in how we learn. What I'm going to be talking about in a little bit is, however, is also how we learn from our own experiences. And the way that Van Gogh talks about it, that he just kept on ceaselessly painting in order to learn painting. I think of myself as a constant learner, as a mediator. There isn't any mediation I do. There isn't any session of a mediation I do where I don't walk away with some lesson about myself as a practitioner, about how I can be effective, about the kinds of questions I can ask, about the perspectives I can bring. And it's essential that we see those experiences as opportunities for us to learn. Because the failure to do that is to end up in the rut, where every day is a kind of grind. It's the same old, same old. You just keep doing it. You do it well. You're helping people. There's no question about that. You're not harming them. But they're not getting the best of you, and you don't have the sense that you are at your best in those moments either. And both are important. It's both important to the clients, the people who've entrusted themselves and their dispute to us, and it's for our own intrinsic benefit, our own sense of satisfaction, that we learn how to be more adept and resourceful. Even when we're playing flute to a kitten. Okay, failure. None of us really like to think as though we've failed, but in fact, we do. And Michael Jordan has said it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this quote from Samuel Beckett in just a minute. But I want to tell you about my own experience. And one of the things that I will say to you is that if you were ever to attend a training and participate in a workshop where I have written the role play, you can be sure that that role play is based upon a failure of mine. It's based upon a situation where I was not at my best, where I was clumsy, perhaps, where I was less adept than I would like to be, where I missed opportunities to do something, or I took an opportunity to do something that I shouldn't have. And because I don't just take those failures as something to grumble about and to complain about or to whine about. Yes, yeah, I'm frustrated just like anybody else. I don't like to fail. And at the same time, when I have not been at my best, then rather than just complaining, I try to figure out what occurred, why that situation went the way it did, and to learn how to be smarter, more cognizant, more resourceful in what I do. There was at a time in my mediation practice when I was I'd had a few years experience, and I was trying to expand my work and had never had at that time a single referral from an attorney. I received a phone call from two attorneys who said that they were working with in a post-divorce dispute, that there was a court hearing in 3 days, and that they thought that it should be, they thought there was a good chance that the parties could come to an agreement, and would I take this on? And pride got the better of me, and I said yes. And I'll tell you why I say that pride got the better of me, because I assumed that I could be heroic. I assumed that I could help this couple extract themselves from the jaws of defeat. Defeat meaning a 2-day contested hearing over a possible change in the custody of their 4 children. And at the parents' request, actually at the mother's request, conveyed through her attorney, I agreed to meet with the 4 children. And we had a wonderful conversation, lovely kids. And it was utterly foolhardy on my part to have done that. There was no benefit. I inadvertently dragged the kids further into the dispute than they had been before. And believe me, they had been dragged in plenty deep before I got involved. And I let my own belief in my capacity overcome my better judgment. And that's one of the failures that I think about repeatedly as a way of hoping to keep myself a bit more humble.
Hmm. Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what do these images have in common? Interestingly, they are all depictions of the same village in Ireland.
Huh.
And this reinforces again the idea that we have our own path to take. Each of these artists was using a medium, whether it's oil or pastel or watercolor. They were on either print or on paper or on canvas. They had their own unique perspective as well. I mean, their take on it is influenced in part by the medium that they chose to use and in part by their vision. And the same is true for us, that we have visions. We have, not visions, we have a vision. We have beliefs, we have values, we have theories, we have principles that we rely on. And it's important as part of our work that we are cognizant of those beliefs because they shape what we see and therefore shape how we act. I want to talk for a little bit about mindfulness and then about reflective practice. Ellen Langer is a social psychologist who has written for more than 40 years on mindfulness. And her books are based on experiments that she and her colleagues and graduate students have conducted. One of them, for example, was to take a group of elderly men, I think they were all in their 80s, and they moved them for 2 weeks into a facility away from wherever they had been living. And they had specifically, the researchers had specifically constructed the facility in such a way that it reminded, that it had all of the elements of the 1950s, of 40 years or so before 40 years earlier, so that the food that they were served, the news that appeared on television, the music that was played, the furnishings, the furniture, the dishes that were used, everything was from the 1950s. And they measured pre and post experiment the cognitive abilities of these 80-year-old men, and found that having gone through this experience, they were sharper, their memories were clearer than they had been before, they were more aware of what was going on. And she has conducted many of these kinds of experiments where what she's demonstrating is that the influence of what we think about and how we think about things shapes what we do and how we act. Another example is that she worked with a group of housekeepers, women who worked in a hotel or motel. And she recast in their minds the idea. They were, and the women who were particularly selected, I think, were overweight, a bit out of shape, who wanted to lose some weight. And she recast what they were doing as exercise instead of manual labor, and found that at the end of the experiment, they had lost weight. They were feeling better about themselves physically. And she also talks about mindlessness, which is a part that I want to focus on for a second. And I'll give you an example that Ellen Langer talks about out of her own experience. She went to a store to buy purchase something, and she handed the clerk her credit card. The clerk handed it back saying, I'm sorry, but you haven't signed the credit card. Handed Ellen Langer a pen. She dutifully signed the back of the card, handed it to the clerk, who processed the transaction, gave her the slip to sign, which she did, and then the clerk compared the signatures on the slip and the signature on the back of the card.
No.
Yeah. And what you assume, of course, is that the clerk was schooled, was trained, it was drilled into her mind. You always compare the signatures as a way of preventing fraud. That lesson makes a lot of sense. But when you do that without thinking, if you do it mindlessly, then it becomes kind of dumb. And the same thing is true for us, I think, as mediators. One of the places where I see this happen all the time is with mediators who conduct and who, in the process of an opening statement or an introduction, you might as well play a tape recorder with no one else in the room, because I've listened to the same mediator do the same introduction over and over. It doesn't change no matter who's in the room. It doesn't change no matter how old or how young the parties are, whether they're represented by counsel, they're not represented by counsel. It is the same introduction. And substantively, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the introduction. It's comprehensive, it's clear, but it's delivered in an utterly mindless way that has nothing to do with the people sitting in front of her. There's no connection, there's no interaction. It is though what she's doing is she's doing to them rather than with them. And when we act that way in our work, that kind of mindlessness that we can laugh about in the store clerk is manifest in our own practices. And we need to be very careful not to let that happen. more than meets the eye. One other quick story that she tells is, I don't know whether it's her story or where it comes from, but it does appear in her book, Mindfulness. And that's the story about the young child who's watching the parent, in this case, the mother, prepare a roast for dinner. And the parent goes to the fridge, takes the roast out, puts it on the counter, uses a knife to slice small slices off each end, puts the roast in the pan, puts the slices in with the roast on top of the roast, and then puts the pan in the oven. And the kid is utterly fascinated by this. And being 6 years old, of course, asks, why? And the mom says, well, that's how I learned how to make it from my mom. She said, but Grandma's in the next room, go ask her. So the kid goes running into the next room. Grandma, I just saw something that's really interesting in the kitchen. Mommy did this and that and that. And she describes the whole thing and then says to the grandma, how come you did it that way? And the grandmother laughs, almost till tears come out of her eyes, and says, because back then, my pan was too small. And it's that kind of mindlessness, never asking the reason why we do something. So much of training that occurs, while great in terms of describing skills, techniques, tools, strategies that we as mediators can use, and demonstrating and giving trainees the opportunity to practice the use of them, the question that isn't well addressed, if at all, is why? Why would you ever use this tool in this circumstance and for what purpose? Because without understanding the why, we're just going to cook the roast exactly the same way our parent did. Now, for years, I've been thinking about, talking about, writing about, teaching about this thing called reflective practice. And it was at the heart of my book, The Making of a Mediator. And I want to talk just a little bit about the nature of reflective practice, because a lot of people think that it's just sort of sitting down and saying, well, that was an interesting piece of work. Yeah, this is what happened. And just sort of ruminating about what happened, just recalling the events as they unfolded. But reflective practice is more than that. It is learning about what we did well, what we may have done less well, or what we may have done poorly, by understanding the why as well as the what. As Dewey says, we don't just learn from our experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And if we go back to the quote from Van Gogh, this would also be the case. I'm sure that in continuing to paint so that he could learn painting, there was always a sense of self-reflection, of wondering about how a particular technique or the use of a particular color may have achieved a vision that he had for what he wanted to create, or it failed to do that. And there are a couple of, another nice reflection. A couple of things that I want to talk about with respect to reflective practice, because this is not a webinar just about reflective practice. But there are two aspects that are really, really important. And that's the notion of espoused theory and theory in use. And essentially, espoused theory is what we say we do. For example, I have a friend who would say that she is a pure facilitative mediator. That's how she would describe, and she could explain why she believes that a facilitated approach is exactly the best one. And yet, if you watch her mediate, what you see is very different. Frequently interjecting opinions, offering solutions, acting in a much more directive kind of way, in a way that would be in contradiction, really, to the theory that she was espousing. And the way we behave is termed theory in use by Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen. And one of the things that I have been stressing in my own practice and in all the work I do, whether it's as a teacher, a coach, or in writing, is to bring together and to merge those two. Essentially, I want to be able to walk my talk. I want what I do to match what I believe. My experience is that I am at my highest competence and effectiveness when those two are aligned. When I am acting completely in concert with what I believe. And when we act in a way that is different, then it seems as though we are tinkering rather than being professionals. We're still being benevolent, we're being kind, we're being helpful, but there's a difference between sort of tinkering at something, just trying one thing after another. Well, if that didn't work, then this will work, then this might work, then that might work, rather than having a set of beliefs that we follow. Not that we follow as all that I've been saying so far in this webinar, not that we follow them with such rigid adherence that they become doctrines, that we become doctrinaire and essentially encaged by our own beliefs, but rather they provide a solid foundation for the work that we do. Mm. And a second piece that's really important about reflective practice is the difference between single loop and double loop learning. And this example is simple and it's really clear, I think. You can set a thermostat that will adjust based on the temperature you've set. If the room gets too warm, it cools. If it gets too warm, it cools. If it gets too cold, it warms. And that's an example of single loop learning. That would be akin to our own experience of, well, I've been meeting for the last hour in joint session. Let's try, maybe meeting in private session will work. So we separate the parties and we meet in caucus. That's a shift. That's doing something different that may result in success. But what we don't ask ourselves in that situation is what is happening in the joint session that is creating a situation that in our thinking might benefit from a private session or a caucus. And if a caucus is useful, why would it be useful? What are the possible gains that could be derived, and what are the possible limitations? Because as Argyris says, in double loop learning, the thermostat would ask, why am I set to 68? Why do we choose that temperature rather than any other temperature that might be either more comfortable for us, more economical, whatever our goals are? What are the goals for using the thermostat? What are the goals for using the private session? What are the goals for doing brainstorming? It isn't just the doing of them, it's the understanding of our rationale. And part of reflective practice, both in the moment and after the fact, is to be able to ask ourselves that question and to be able to learn from our experience.
Okay. Mike, can I ask you?
Of course.
Have you ever found good opportunities for inviting people to help you to be more reflective? For instance, if there are situations that you know you're doing by rote and that you're just doing out of habit, are there times where you have found it effective to invite people to provide their feedback or to help to wake you up and be more aware of what's going on?
Absolutely. There are, and I'm going to talk about them in just a second,
Right.
Claire, but I will. And the answer essentially is yes. And there are two ways. One way that I'm going to talk about in a minute that I'll hold, but the other is where you end up talking with or working with colleagues or others who are familiar enough with your work and the work itself and you to be able to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, I ask my clients. I talk with them all the time about what's happening. And I stop periodically, often, and ask them, how is everything going? What's working for you? To give them an opportunity to provide me with some feedback. And I might, although this is somewhat more rare, I might actually say to them, did you find that when we met in separate session, that was at all helpful? And if so, in what ways? Because, and as, for example, as part of my introduction, I say to my clients, you can stop me at any moment and ask me why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I will answer you. We will stop right then and I will explain not what I'm doing, but why.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So now I'm going to, so to me, and this we're going to be wrapping up now. First of all, it has to begin with an intention. If you don't have the intention to learn, it doesn't matter what else happens, you're not going to. And if you don't have the intention to improve the quality of your work, then you will just continue to do the same thing over and over again. Not that that's necessarily terrible, but it's not what it could be. You're leaving opportunities on the table that could be explored, both for the parties and for yourself. So be attentive is the next. Notice what's new, avoid focusing on predictable behaviors and comments. Being attentive to the parties, because it's very easy when people come in with the Smiths come in the morning and the Joneses in the afternoon, and they sound and they look quite a bit alike. They're about the same age. They've got some, but they're not. They're unique people. And this isn't just a matter of respect, which is also important, but it is in their uniqueness that they find a way to quarrel and they find a way to work through their differences. And if we don't notice the uniqueness about them, then we may miss opportunities to help them do what they've come to do. And secondly, of course, we need to be attentive to ourselves. What's happening within me? What am I focusing on something that's different? Am I aware of myself in a way that, in such a way that I can be cognizant of my reaction to the parties? Next, ask questions. Be curious. That, again, applies both to what happens in the mediation and asking questions of ourselves. Read. I can't tell you how important this is, because it isn't just what we learn, although that's important. It is what those pieces that we read stimulates in us. It's the thinking. It's challenging us to question what we're doing, not in a way that seeks to undermine all of the values and the beliefs we have, but rather that opens us to new perspectives, new ideas. Take time to reflect. I recommend, and when I teach about reflective practice, I invite, and in fact, when I do role plays in the trainings, I ask the parties the people who are going to play the role of the mediator to think about what they're going to be doing and why they're going to be doing certain things based on the scenario. And then our conversation afterwards, the reflective debrief, the coaching that occurs afterwards, is based on these basic principles of attempting to learn, not just recounting what took place, not simply asking, what did you like about what you did and what would you do differently? That's okay. Those questions aren't bad. They just don't provide much more than superficial awareness of those things. So I've created some inventories, I call them. They are questionnaires that can be used before and after each meeting to help for self-reflection. And I'm going to make sure that those are available and linked to this webinar. Next, maintain a learning journal. This is not Dear Diary, but this is a way of keeping track of what we've learned from our experiences. And everybody's going to do it differently. Some people do it much more formally. Some people do it in the form of notes. Some people do it with pencil and paper. Some people do it on their computer. Some people write pages. Some people write a few notes as an outline. It doesn't matter. The importance is to keep track to help you keep track in your own mind of what you're learning, to see the evolution of your thinking and your approaches to conflicts. And lastly, and this is what I think, what I wanted to hold, Claire, in response to your question.
Yeah.
And that is, get involved in a reflective practice peer group. I have been involved as a participant and as a leader of peer groups for over 30 years. And they have proved to be extraordinary experiences, no matter what role I happen to be playing. It's easy enough to organize them. I'm going to also, as part of this webinar, I'm going to post some information about starting a reflective practice group and why you might want to be in one.
Great.
I'm currently facilitating a group for the ABA section on dispute resolution, the mediation committee. I am facilitating another group, and the one with the ABA is done as a telephone conference call. I'm doing another group with the Academy of Professional Family Mediators, APFM. That one's done on Zoom. So we've got people who we're able to see as well as hear one another. And I'm developing peer groups for a couple of other organizations. It's easy to start. It's easy to organize. And the richness that of learning that's possible is quite extraordinary. And I'm going to leave you with this. This is part of the Samuel Beckett quote from earlier, which is, ever tried, ever failed, try again, fail better. And forgive the moment of self-indulgence here. This is actually a piece that was created by one of my sons who's an artist. And when I saw it in his studio, being a good dad, I paid him for it, but I really wanted it because it captures exactly what I want to be able to say, is that we need to be able to take mindful, respectful, and purposeful risks in what we do, and risk the possibility that we won't do, that it won't turn out exactly as we hope. But if we've done it with full regard for our responsibilities to the parties, if we've done it intentionally for the purpose of helping them and learning, then even if we fail, we will quickly be able to recover from that, and we'll learn how to fail better the next time. And we'll constantly be improving our work. Mm. So thank you all for the opportunity to be part of Mediate.com University. And one last thing I will say, because you're watching and listening to this without the ability to interact as Claire has, I want to invite any of you who may have questions about any aspect of this presentation or anything that it sparks in you to contact me by email at mlang@mediate.com. Thanks.
Thank you.